saying it was your fault, although you could have done more. Oh, you're so naive, yes, so how could this be done with such a smiling sweetheart?
Story time. The year was 2002. I was an innocent and naive 9-year-old lad, and a big fan of the Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon series. During my many visits to our local electronics boutique store, I would marvel at all the awesome-looking games that I knew I'd never be able to play, because I was only getting about $5 a week in pocket money and would get maybe 1 or 2 games as gifts for Christmas or my birthday if I was lucky. I didn't have much use going there, except maybe buying a pack of Pokemon cards every few weeks. It was then that something caught my eye: Crash Bandicoot XS and Spyro Season of Ice. 2 games from my favourite series that I had never heard of and were on one of those Nintendo handhelds I'd heard so much about. Being able to play Crash and Spyro on the go, during car trips, in my bedroom, visiting the grandparents, such a concept was mind-blowing to me. Oh, how I made it ever so unsubtle to my parents how much I wanted them. But surely they'd think twice before buying me a whole new console just to play 2 games and maybe check out that Pokemon game everyone at school wouldn't shut up about, right? Well, fast forward to Christmas that year, and what do I find under the tree? A brand new PS1 to replace our old one that crapped out, and the original Ratchet & Clank for PS2. What? I thought, but you could have easily used that money to buy me a Game Boy and one of those other games. That was legitimately my mindset in that situation. I can only imagine my aversion to children today as just me projecting a deep-seated hatred for myself. Now in the current year, I'm a working adult with too much disposable income and access to the internet, so now I can buy all the old games I want that I was never able to afford as a child. Among those, I thought I owed it to myself to finally get those Crash and Spyro games I longed for all those years ago, and after finally getting around to playing them, I can only conclude that 9-year-old me can die in a fucking fire. You were upset that you got Ratchet & Clank over these? You ungrateful little shit. It's fine, younger me learned his lesson in disappointment when he got into the Dragonfly for his birthday a year later. But I digress, we've got games to talk about. Crash Bandicoot XS, or Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure as those of you in the US and Canada will know it. Why was this name change necessary? I have absolutely no clue. The game comes to us from Vicarious Visions, who as far as Crash is concerned are known for developing Crash Nitro Kart, which was basically the poor man's Crash Team Racing. But they also went on to make 2017's Crash Bandicoot The Insane Trilogy, which aside from a few nitpicks was a fantastic remake of the first 3 Crash games. Unfortunately, Crash Bandicoot XS is pretty much just a discount Crash 3 with bits of Crash 2 sprinkled in. This game really is just an exercise in seeing how Crash handles on the Game Boy Advance, because there's very little in this game that hasn't already been done before in previous titles. You play through 5 levels to collect crystals before you fight a boss and then proceed to the next warp room, rinse and repeat until you make it to Cortex. Although this is a significantly shorter game than any of its console counterparts, so a lot of the levels are quite small and there's only 4 warp rooms in total compared to the usual 5. Most of the level assets, enemies, and music are ripped straight from Cortex Strikes Back and Warped. Crash's sprites are 2D conversions of his model from the PS1 games, and you still get the same unlockable powers from Crash 3. Minus the bazooka because there's only 4 warp rooms, and after playing through this I can already tell you that it wouldn't have done much good at any point. As far as 2D platformers go, for the most part this is a perfectly serviceable game. Each level is relatively well designed and provide a decent challenge, and in some of the later levels there's some moments that require good planning, a keen eye, and careful backtracking if you're going for the box gems, that feel very in line with some of the levels from Crash 2 and 3. Controls are relatively responsive and close to how the PS1 titles handle, although if you're going off muscle memory there may be a few parts that will trip you up, particularly in encounters with certain returning hazards, or while doing the relic challenges. Outside of the standard platforming levels, there are also sequences that go pseudo 3D and play around with the Mode 7, which are gorgeous to look at but largely play like arse. The first is the sequences that happen partway through a few of the ice levels, where you drop into a pit and ride on Polar to run away from a Yeti. These running towards the camera sections have always been the target of much ire since the series began, but it's particularly bad here with how crunched down the screen is. The console games at least gave you good signposting to warn of upcoming hazards, but these ones aren't so considerate. The second is flying levels, and these things can fuck right off. Think of a combination of the jetpack levels from Crash 2 combined with the plane levels from Crash 3. Except it's entirely automatic, linear, you can barely see where you're shooting because Crash's body is in the way of everything directly in front of you, and they go on for way too long. Without counting deaths, these things can go on for like 4 to 5 minutes at a time. But with the way Crash's model makes Amy a complete crapshoot most of the time, and even Cortex's blimps can shoot at you now, you'll more than likely be dying a bit on your first time around. Last up is the boss fights, and they're really nothing remarkable. Dingo Dial is a standard lure the enemy into hurting themselves affair. Engine is a flying level boss fight, so screw him. Tiny is a combination of his platform-to-platform chase from Crash 2 and his striking the ground until eventually getting stuck battle from Crash 3. Except it's in 2D now, so he can come from above and below you, which makes it a lot easier to accidentally clip into him and die. And Cortex is... and I thought his Crash 2 boss fight was an embarrassment. Just take his Crash 1 boss fight and replace any semblance of challenge with dodging a reticle for a few seconds and getting him to shoot gems. And this brings the game's Cortex shrinks down the world plot into question a bit. Why did Cortex shrink down all his minions as well? Why is Crash regular size when it comes to taking on Cortex at the end of the game? If you're not going to do anything interesting with this idea, then why do it at all? You could have made the plot about Cortex stealing Crash's shoes and it would have had precisely the same impact on the rest of the game. Crash 1 was about going to Cortex's castle to stop his unethical experiments. As such, the level design reflects this by showing you going between each island on the journey to get to Cortex's castle. Crash 2 was about Cortex manipulating Crash to find the crystals for him. It still took place on the 3 islands, except now Crash was after particular MacGuffins, so he was transporting to places where he'd be able to find crystals rather than going on one cohesive journey. In Crash 3 you were still going after crystals, except this time it used the plot device of the Time Twister machine as an excuse to change up the level design to different places throughout history. The plot of Crash Bandicoot XS involves Cortex shrinking down the planet, but beyond the context of the plot, this isn't used to any particular degree. It isn't utilized for unique level design or interesting enemy encounters, it's just bog-standard Crash Bandicoot locations with a crystal waiting for you at the end. The planet being shrunk down to the size of Dingodole's left nut means nothing, unless it's supposed to be a metaphor for Crash being shrunk down to a handheld adventure you can carry in your pocket. Oh, you crafty bastards. I had a lot to whine about, but Crash Bandicoot XS is about what you'd expect from a portable Crash experience from the turn of the millennium. The standard platforming levels are pretty well designed and true to the Crash formula, and it'd be nice to have on a car ride, but it really doesn't feel all that significant. Even more so now in a day and age where I can just pull out my PS Vita and play the original 3 games anytime I want wherever I go. It's not bad, but you can do a lot better in terms of Crash games and handheld platformers in general. Overall, I'd say a Game Boy Advance interpretation of Crash makes sense for the most part. The level design of Naughty Dog-era Crash games were a series of linear gauntlets that could be done in 3D and as a side-scroller, but Spyro was a different beast altogether. His levels were by and large more open-ended, usually giving you several different places you can wander off the beaten path to find collectibles or side activities outside of the route to the exit portal, and the gameplay in general was more complex than the Crash games. Given the limitations of the Game Boy Advance, how do you translate gameplay like this to 2D? By making it an isometric platformer, of course. Outstanding. Before I go into more detail, I just want to say that this game looks and sounds really good. Like, overall, a lot better than Crash XS did. The sprites are colourful and detailed, the animations are fluid and clean, the UI is a spot-on recreation of the one seen in Spyro 2 and Year of the Dragon, and the sound effects are relatively high-quality rips of the ones from the PS1 games that help give the game an extra bit of authenticity that make it really feel like you're playing a Spyro game. None of this matters, however, when you get down to this game's biggest weakness, the level design. Oh god, the level design. I mentioned that it'd be difficult to translate traditional Spyro gameplay to 2D, and Season of Ice proves that it just absolutely does not work. This is what the standard levels look like in Spyro Season of Ice. A collection of blocks assorted in an isometric viewpoint pasted on top of bottomless pits and insta-death water. The sprite work may make most of the levels nice to look at, but there's next to nothing in the way of landmarks to know where to go and where you've been, and because of that pretty much everywhere in each level ends up looking identical. And by the way, why does Spyro instantly die when he falls in water? In the original game he had the chance to jump out and get back to dry land as long as he still had sparks with him, and in Spyro 2 and 3 he could swim. The level design in the other games utilised a lot more environmental hazards than just death pits, or, deadly liquids that weren't water. I get that level design utilities are significantly more limited on the Game Boy Advance, but I'd prefer other alternatives to edging around the blocky environments and sinking to my death because I dipped one foot in a corner of water. The Roman City level in particular can fuck right off for having this kind of level design and also expecting you to chase around a thief in a watery gauntlet like this. I admit with absolutely no shame that I had to play this using the fan-made level maps as reference to have half an idea of where I was going, because on top of the absolutely bland level design, the screen crunch was so bad and gave me such a limited field of view that I was carefully inching my way around the level just trying not to get blindsided by an enemy I couldn't see. Navigating these levels filled me with such a constant sense of unease, and not in a good way. A lot of enemies move very erratically, and you usually don't see them until it's too late and they've already hit you. Another big issue came from perspective. When gliding from one blocky island to another, you need to take into account how many blocks high the platforms across from you are, and how many blocks high you currently are. Otherwise you'll be gliding into a wall and falling straight to your death. It seems like basic platformer design, but when you take into account that this is all on an isometric 2D plane, and in a very tiny field of view, you'll be doing many leaps of faith if you haven't got the map to help you. All of this especially doesn't help with one of the objectives in each level, that requires you to flame a certain amount of objects hidden around the level. Once you've flamed all of them, you get a fairy, this game's equivalent of orbs and eggs. It doesn't sound so bad on paper, but you'll have to navigate the forgettable and samey landscapes, make leaps of faith left and right, avoid hazards that could come from off-screen at almost any time, and you have to ignite every single one without dying. You could get 9 out of 10, but if you misjudge a jump on your way to the last one and fall in a river, you have to find them all over again. And people gave Crash 1 flack for doing this with the box gems. This is like trying to play Crash 1 while looking through a cardboard tube. Sparks makes his return with his gameplay from Year of the Dragon. And honestly, I think these levels are probably the best part of the game. It's a top-down shooter that controls pretty much identical to the PS1 version. The Sparks levels weren't exactly the most exciting part of Year of the Dragon, but they're perfectly functional here, and that's really the most I could ask for. But there's honestly not a lot more that can be said about these. Outside of standard exploration levels, this game tries to recreate the speedway levels from the console Spyro games. These play just like the flying levels from Crash Bandicoot XS, except they somehow made them even worse. Your aim is already thrown off by Spyro being in the way of most of his targets, but now there's a time limit to go along with it. It was something that didn't seem so bad at first, but then I actually tried playing it. Most of the challenge was just your standard flying through rings and killing fodder, but then out of nowhere right at the end I had to take on a serpentine dragon. Remember that boss fight in the fireworks factory from Year of the Dragon, where you had to fly around and shoot down the twin dragons, and every time you hit them a piece of their bodies would fly off and they'd become increasingly harder to hit because they became smaller, and that would make the battle go on for a painful amount of time? Just imagine that, except you have a time limit. I went up against this asshole about 5 times, having to go through the entire speedway to get to him, and the time limit would always run out because I just couldn't hit the damn thing. Spyro's model not only got in the way of shots, which made it hard to aim, but it also made dodging his attacks difficult because I could barely even see them. And every time you get hit, you lose time. That right there was enough for me to just want to avoid every speedway for the rest of my playthrough. But then I eventually paused the game and I thought to myself, why am I trying to 100% this? For self-satisfaction? Am I really going to come back to play this again after I finish it? I'm not getting any fun out of trying to finish everything in this game. I'm just getting frustrated in the mindless pursuit of an arbitrary score for a game I never got to play 16 years ago. And from that point I just pressed on, going from world to world with the absolute bare minimum requirement for fairies and gems required to proceed. Years of being conditioned to 100% finish collectathon platformers whenever I played them make me feel like I was missing out on half of the game. But at that point I had just stopped caring. I saw it through to the final world, got to a progress wall that wouldn't let me take on the final boss unless I collected every fairy in the game, and then I decided that was a good place to get off. Maybe the last boss is actually fun to fight, unlike that previous encounter with Grendor, which was just an embarrassment. Doesn't matter, because I'll be damned if I'm going back to play more of those levels or beat the speedway challenges. I'm done here. Spyro Season of Ice clocks in at only 4 or 5 hours, but it's one of the first games I've played in a while that felt like an outright chore to get through. It looks and sounds nice enough, but the levels are bare and boring, the platforming lacks perspective, the end-level tasks are more asinine and repetitive than they are fun, and at times it's difficult for all the wrong reasons. It's not a borderline unplayable mess like Enter the Dragonfly, but it is incredibly boring, and in some respects that's a much worse fate. It feels good to finally get these games out of the way. I think my next step will be to build a time machine and send this video to my younger self on a CD as a cautionary tale, to spend his time enjoying the games he already has rather than fretting about these two, because someday he'll be able to play all the ones that seem so out of reach in his leisure. Although if I did have access to a time machine, I'd probably just send myself back and beat the crap out of Kid Me for being a cringy disappointment who didn't take care of his old PS1 jewel cases, acted like an autist for attention, cried at the slightest provocation, and unironically enjoyed the Pokemon anime.